Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are online, back to our last session of the conference. And with me, we have President Luis Guillermo Solís Rivera, who will serve as a moderator. Also, Saskia Carusi from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and Donna, Hrinak, Florida International University Board of Trustees member. Let me introduce President Solís, although he doesn't need any presentation. President Solís served as President of Costa Rica from 2014 to 2018. He's currently the Interim Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University. In 1984, 1984, he began his service to Costa Rica in the Foreign Ministry, leading Costa Rican delegations to the United Nations, the Organization of American States, and the European Union. He was the country's ambassador for Central American Affairs, and for 2 decades held the office of Secretary General of the Government National Liberation Party in Costa Rica. He previously taught at the University of Michigan, and in 1999 was a Fulbright Scholar at FIU. President Solís is a graduate of the University of Costa Rica and has a master's degree in political science and sociology from Tulane University. He has published more than 10 books and dozens of articles for professional journals. So you have just joined, all of you have just joined the panel of the role of the regional partners. And with that, le paso la palabra, Presidente.
Muchas gracias, José Miguel. Good afternoon to all. Thank you very much for joining us in this last panel of what has been a very exciting day, talking about resilience in Central America. And now we're going to be talking about what you talked about in the morning, and also about the insights that we will get from our 2 very distinguished panelists. Allow me to present Saskia Carusi first, because she's going to present a video, which I think it's going to be very interesting for us to watch. Saskia Carusi is graduated in social anthropology from the University of Sussex and in integral risk management from the University of San Pablo in Guatemala. She has a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Social Studies at The Hague, with a specialization in local and regional development. She is currently External Relations Officer for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Regional Office for the Americas at the Caribbean based in Panama, and is the focal point for communication, fundraising, and safe schools, providing technical assistance partners on the implementation of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. She has extensive previous experience with working with international NGOs such as Oxfam and Cooperazione Internazionale, with 20 years of experience managing projects and programs in risk reduction in Latin America and North Africa. Saskia, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So thank you, Guillermo Solís, and thank you very much for Donna, Hrinak. I hope I'm pronouncing it well. And thank you very much for the Florida International University for the invitation to this very relevant seminar and workshop after the recent events in Central America. So as you said, I would like to share a video. The video is quite short, but it's to the point, and I think that it's relevant to what the discussion has been today, and also as a kickoff to this last conclusive panel. So the technical, I think I shared it yesterday. So I will mute myself.
You've seen me in the news. I cost you hundreds of billions of dollars each year. I destroy lives. Sometimes forever. By now, you probably met me in person. Do I have your attention? So far, you have defended yourself. responded, tried to rebuild what I destroyed. You recovered, and eventually, you forgot. Disaster, respond, recover, repeat. Disaster,
Disaster.
respond,
Respond.
recover,
Recover.
repeat.
Repeat. We have to break this vicious cycle. Recover better. Reduce risk. Build resilience. Focus on prevention. Prevention saves lives.
Yes, so it's a short video. It's a little bit more than 1 minute, but it actually shows the example of how we need to break the cycle. And this is actually what's happening in Central America and what you've been discussing up to now. Extreme events are also increasing due to climate variability, to a very complex, vulnerable situation, as we have seen in the discussions. And so what we need is to try and break the cycle and not to repeat. So try really to reduce disaster risk. And that actually means working very much together with development, with the Sustainable Development Agenda, and having a development that is the risk-proofed, that is informed by risk and risk sensitive. So every decision we take in all the dimensions of society, because disaster affects all the society, so we can reduce risk from infrastructure, from governance, from law, from community level, from education, from digital connection, from working with people on the move, with inclusion. So try to really embed it, disaster risk reduction, within all our policy and at different levels. And also I would like, as a initial remark, get to a point about the use of the concept of natural disaster, because I heard it mentioned before, and we will never get tired of stressing it from our office. We've been doing a lot of campaigning and advocacy in the last year on trying to not use the concept natural disaster, because words and concept have power, actually then drive actions, drive change, or in this case, inaction. If we define a disaster as natural, then it implies that there's nothing we can do, because it's simply nature. We know that nature is the one that has the hazards, or the phenomenon, or the threats, depending on how you want to call it and from what region. That's a natural dimension, but all the rest is not natural. If we are exposed to that hazard, if we live and build near a river that floods, if we build infrastructure near a coastline where there's a high tsunami threat, if we have villages around volcanoes, we are actually creating that exposure to that hazard. And all the dimensions of vulnerability that we have, I was not able to join all of the discussion today. I joined the last hour, which was really interesting. All the dimensions that were discussed, which are related to vulnerability, is something that we have control. It's not something that is natural. So we can try and work and do efforts to reduce those vulnerability, improve governance. Governance was mentioned very much as a key dimension, and we also always stress that good governance is key to reducing risk. And so just try to stress the importance of not using the concept natural disasters, because that implies then that we are not going to have action, and that it's just natural and there's nothing we can do around it.
Thank you, Saskia. Our second distinguished member of this panel is Ambassador Donna Hrinak. She is currently the Senior Vice President of the Royal Caribbean Group here in Miami. Before working at the Royal Caribbean Group, she also worked at the Boeing Company, PepsiCo, and Kraft Foods, and she served as a strategic advisor at McLarty Associates. But before entering the private sector, Ambassador Donna Hrinak was a career officer in the U.S. Foreign Service with assignments in Latin America and Eastern Europe. She served as U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic, and she was also Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department. She is a member of the boards of Latin Global Education, the Inter-American Dialogue, and she serves in the Board of Trustees of our own Florida International University. Ambassador Hrinak is a graduate of Michigan State University and also attended the George Washington University and the University of Notre Dame School of Law. Thank you very much, Ambassador Hrinak. I don't know if you, if I will, well, I think I will continue calling you Ambassador Hrinak, if you don't mind, although I know that you would prefer to be Donna but having you here on your official capacity, I think I will continue calling you Ambassador Hrinak, if that's all right.
Absolutely, although I usually say that ambassadors for a much older woman, but okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, allow me to begin this conversation, because this is going to be more a conversation than anything else. Picking up something that Saskia said, basically regarding the multi-casual relationships in dealing with extreme events and disasters in general. I mean, the reasons for this to happen and becoming real social disasters have to do with a number of events or of causes: structural, conjunctural. Some of them have to do with politics. Some other has to do with the economy. But all in all, resilience, lacking of resilience, all vulnerabilities result from these multiple sources of issues. And therefore, in order to deal with them, you also have to think in different approaches. You have to come to the solution of this from different places. I would like to ask Saskia about the international community first, and then ask Ambassador Hrinak about the role of the private sector, because we have been talking a lot about the public sector, which, mind you, is a fundamental actor here. States, governments, municipal governments, and of course, the civil society. But what about the private sector? That is something I would like to pay some attention to, because, you know, we will see how complex this is and how it touches the private sector. But in terms of the multilateral organization, Saskia, and the role in putting together these efforts, what is their role? How do you think we can enhance that very fundamental function in dealing with these events?
Yes, thank you very much. I first would like to recall the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is actually the mandate of our office in support its coordination and implementation. And this is a framework that was adopted in the Third World Conference in 2015 by member states in the city of Sendai. And it had a novelty compared to its previous, the YOGO frame of action. It has like concrete targets that countries want to achieve in 2030. And one of the 7 global targets is actually on increasing cooperation in disaster risk reduction. It's its target F, and it has a different dimension. It wants to increase international support through multilateral cooperation in disaster risk reduction, increase bilateral cooperation, also including South-South, increase the transfer of technology for disaster risk reduction, transfer of knowledge, transfer of science and academy, capacity building, and also capacity building of statistical offices. So there's so many dimensions where there's support that can be provided for disaster risk reduction. And these are all the kind of different channels that the member states defined in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which is kind of the global policy on the way forward through its target F, which is one of the 7 global targets. Then, as you said, the causes of disaster is multi-causal. We are also in a situation where disaster risk is becoming more and more compound and simultaneous. We saw with the Hurricane Eta and Iota, it was simultaneous with the COVID crisis. And then you had one event with a week difference impacting the same region. So it makes it even more and more harder to prepare to it, to save life, which is the most immediate action, but also on how you reduce this risk, getting these more and more complex scenarios. As you mentioned, there's also a complex scenario of draft in the region, of all the migration, which are people who have a much more higher vulnerability. So what we try to do is work with regional organization. That was also, there was a question in the previous panel when I joined that was on the role of the intergovernmental regional organizations in all this, and actually was mentioning SICA, which is el Sistema de Integración Centroamericano, the Central American Integration System. So we try to work with them, provide capacity building, risk information, and all the action to try and influence a policy. For sure, the system has its weakness, but it is a system that compares to other sub-regions in the continent is very well established. So it is a system that manages to negotiate and to bring the countries together. It has a lot of challenges in terms on how to make effective policy across countries. Countries keep having their policy quite on their own, let's say, but it is a solid system. And it's a system that has been trying to, after Hurricane Mitch, I think Hurricane Mitch was the most extreme event compared then to ETA and Iota, and that was more than 20 years ago. So after Hurricane Mitch came to the region, the Central American, as a bloc, as countries, because at the end it's small countries who have different development situation, different realities, but they are exposed to the same kind of hazards. They tried to improve all their policies. Hrinak got much stronger during the years. There is a Central American policy for disaster risk reduction or integral risk management, which is the word that is most used in Central America. So from the UN has been trying to support all these definition of policies, of plans, and trying to get away from a focus of only response. Because if we keep working only in response, then it's really, really difficult to work in all these other dimension and levels. And actually, just to conclude this part, there's much more also to say on our role, but I think that advocacy, pushing policy, plans, capacity building, putting forward risk information, risk knowledge to motivate decision making, and also create more synergy and exchanges with other regions to motivate learning and exchanges of best practice. But if we compare Hurricane Mitch to Iota and ETA, I think we can also see three important differences in what has happened in the region, and most of it is also for the support of extra-regional actors. We can see a difference in what policy and plans are in place, because when Hurricane Mitch, there was no in Central America policy on risk reduction, on risk management. Countries did not have their own policy. Everything was most on from the military side. That was more on the response, because that was what was on that in that decade. Well, communications were not the same. We didn't have internet. We didn't have the phone. So communities were totally isolated. And now, yes, it was much, much quicker to know who had a necessity and where to go. And the response capacity really improved. If you compare the death numbers between the Mitch and ETA and Iota, there's a very much reduction in the losses of lives. But the losses of economic assets and of the vulnerability had increased.
So that being the case, Ambassador Hrinak, what's the role for the private sector? And I'm thinking in the bigger role, not only social business responsibility, you know, and painting schools, but a more direct involvement. Do you think that this is possible, that we can explore that possibility?
Well, thank you, Presidente. And first of all, I'm totally opposed to painting schools from the private sector unless you happen to be a paint company and know something about how to paint schools. Just let me say before I answer the question, and I will answer the question, that when Presidente Solís and I first spoke about the possibility of my joining this panel, I said I was totally the wrong person to be part of it. I'm not an expert in resilience, except as, you know, the mother of what were formerly teenagers. I don't have, in my Central American experience was many years ago. And I didn't think that I had much to contribute. And a few things have happened over the last week, and including up till this morning when I was able to listen in on part of Professor Sarmiento's presentation, that made me really want to be part of this conversation. And both from my public experience and the private experience. First of all, we're talking about Central America, and I understand that, and there are special vulnerabilities, but these are not problems that are only relevant for the sub-region, right? They're relevant for the whole hemisphere. They're relevant for the whole world. And that includes the United States. When I say something happened over the last week, watching some of the videos that came out of Texas last week and talk about bad policies contributing to vulnerabilities, they were showing families who were still waiting for funds, were still waiting for attention from Harvey, which took place 2 years ago. And we like to think that we've got the answers in the States. We clearly don't have the answers. I don't think anyone has all of them. And so this just brought home to me how much we need to share solutions and a combination of best practices from other places and local solutions. Because if, and this is a danger when you talk about extra regional actors, and I know because I've been one of those extra regional actors, right? You come in and you think that something you saw work in one country or even in one region in a country will work elsewhere, and it doesn't always. And so that local input is critical. And so I really want to be part of the conversation because I think this is something we can all learn from. I do think there's a role for the private sector, and it's somewhat tied to the ESG agenda if you define the ESG agenda broadly, so that it's environment, it's social, and it's governance, and that you play on your strengths, if you will. You stay in your lane. I don't think, every private sector organization should go out and plant trees to address problems of the environment, for example. I work for Royal Caribbean. Our world is the oceans. If anything happens to the oceans, we don't have a business. So we have a vested interest in that, and we have special knowledge and expertise about the oceans. We should stay in our lane and focus on that. On the social side, we deal with a lot of local communities. And I think we're just understanding how the kind of impact we can have on those local communities. And again, I'm talking not just about in Central America, where we do make port calls, or the Caribbean, where we make lots of port calls, as our name might suggest, but even in small communities in Alaska, Key West, Florida, Bar Harbor, Maine. What kind of an impact do we as a company have on these destinations, as we call them? And what kind of obligation do we have to strengthening their governance in a way that will allow us to continue to do business? I mean, we're obviously, we have to make a profit, right? That's why we're in business. But I worked for PepsiCo, Indra Nooyi, where she talked about performance with purpose. It's not enough at PepsiCo. She's not enough to just make a profit. You have to have another reason to be a good social citizen, a good global citizen as a private sector company. So I think it starts with the G, actually. It starts with good governance within the company and an understanding of what your responsibilities are and the mistakes you might be making. And, if anybody wants to talk about the cruise industry, I'm happy to do that. I'm relatively new to the industry, but I know it gets a bad rap, and sometimes that bad reputation is deserved. Other times it's not. But I do think that it comes from governance first, thinking about how your business is organized and what you can do. And then it gets into the social and environmental aspects of how do you work with the local communities to get these things done. And that's where, after 30 years in government and about not quite half that yet in the private sector, that's the big difference. The private sector can get things done quickly. We know how to execute. We don't have to wait for the interagency process. We don't have to wait for votes of a multitude of countries that may have different agendas when deciding on an issue. And so I think if we can bring that spirit of good management to governance, to public policy making, I think we have an important role to play.
Thank you very much. I would like to keep on talking a little bit about this governmental issue, the governance and the good government both together. Saskia, your partners, your natural partners in multilateral organizations are governments, and so there is broad dissatisfaction with governments. Mine in 2014 and 2018, and everybody else's. There is a dissatisfaction with democracy as it works in Latin America mainly. Should not be easy to work with governments these days with so much tension internally going on. But how can you improve that relationship, turning sometimes an adversarial relationship in a working relationship that would be positive in the management or in risk management? What's your experience in this regard, Saskia?
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate the emphasis on governance, because we actually have been stressing the importance of governance for disaster risk reduction, because you really need that element to be able to reduce risk across all of society, across the different level, like territorial, from the local level, municipal, district, and the national level. So yes, we work with governments. Governments are our key partners, governments and interregional organizations as well, because that for us is a very important alliance, especially as a region of Central America, as I said before, has this institutional framework already set up for regional work, and also because our office is a regional office, so we try to support our regional counterparts like Hrinak, Sedima, Caprade, and other regions to then support a country. Countries have different level of interest, of engagement, different level of priorities also, depending on how what government is there, how it changes. In some countries, there's also a challenge of high turnover of technical staff. So it's not only the political staff, the political figure that changes, which is correct in a democratic system, but also the technical staff. So that sometimes brings some challenges, because you have to start all over the capacity building process. Another way also, which is really important, relates to the private sector, is working with other partners. Working with the academia, then science and technology, that have a key role in supporting partners in actually drafting policy and implementing policy, in bringing concrete data and evidence. And the private sector, actually the Sendai frameworks recognizes the role of the private sector in disaster risk reduction. And as the ambassador just said, it has a real important role, which goes much beyond painting and social corporate responsibility. And one of the role is to work together with government in public-private alliance, and in supporting with its expertise and with capacity to mobilize resources, human, financial resources, with all its quicker capacity, but to work together in alliance with the public sector. So it's another key dimension, to work with all the other partners, be it intergovernmental partners at regional, sub-regional level, and being it other partners, which are the private sector. Civil society holds as a key role, a women's group that work at community level, also the news, the media, the journalist sector. They are all supporting us in this endeavor to work together with government, and actually to implement disaster risk reduction policy that are linked to the sustainable development agenda. And also, when we talk about governments, it's important that we are trying to work with all the sectors, because as I said at the beginning, disaster affects all the sectors of society. So it's not working only with the DRR mandate agencies that in the case of Central America have a challenge, because they're also the response agencies. So they're much more focused on response, COPECO, CONRED, they are all very much focused on that part. So they have more challenges when it has to work with disaster risk reduction. But that means also working with Ministry of Education on how you reduce risk and save schools, working with ministers of finance to have DRR financing, working with infrastructure and public works to have infrastructure that resists, working with agriculture, which is a very important area in Central America. So it's working also with government in a multi-sectoral and intersectoral way.
Ambassador Hrinak, you've been on both sides of the issue. You mentioned correctly, sometimes you were an ambassador, you had to channel aid as a decision maker in Washington. You had to face these issues regionally. And then now, as a leader in the private sector, you see opportunities for this. Let me mention some areas or some sectors, business sectors that I find particularly vulnerable to these events. These events produce migrations, and migrations affect not only international migrations, obviously the United States, etc., when they come all the way here, but there are also south-south migrations. Tourism, that's another one. That's a big one. And then, of course, all the other sectors within countries that may have serious problems when these events hit. For example, telecommunications, for example, the infrastructure businesses, and all of this. Can you think of innovative ways in which the private sector can engage so that, in fact, it can become a partner in what Saskia, correctly talked about, alliances, in the framing, in a new way of framing disaster management and the improvement, the betterment of the conditions of these countries in Latin America, but throughout the world before these events?
Yeah, so I mean, as Saskia was saying, it really has to be a whole of society approach. Civil society, particularly important, and in the my government experience, we spent a lot of time when you're working with USAID or be it the National Endowment for Democracy, to build up a strong civil society. And I think that can make a key difference if you have an organized civil society that has a voice and can influence governments in a way that really no outside actor can. And that can be true also of the local private sector. It's fine for big multinational companies to come in, be that for recovery or for long-term investment, but that local private sector, the domestic private sector, has to also play an important role. On tourism in particular. So a lot of the Caribbean economies, in some cases depend on tourism for 80% of their GDP. Tourism has basically been shut down since last March, thanks to the pandemic. It's been slowly building back up. I'll tell you, we have not been operating since last March, and we're a big contributor to those economies in some of the countries. So I think one issue is also the private sector making sure that the voices of these countries that maybe don't get the attention all the time, in Washington in particular and other capitals around the world, that we can speak for them too. It affects us, but it also affects our partners. And I really believe they are our partners. We share good times and bad. And sometimes we can give a voice in capitals or in multilateral organizations that it's hard for smaller countries to do. I also think we can set examples. I spent all those years I spent in government, I have to say I developed a great admiration for the US private sector, which I often saw setting the standards. Yeah, there were some awful cases too, but in general, the US private sector does a pretty good job of being a good citizen. It's certainly during the time I was in government. And so I think setting an example and reaching out to private sector partners who can be our customers or can be our suppliers in those countries and making sure that we're all collaborating. We talk about the education, and really this all starts with education in many ways. I mean, obviously, yes, the Ministry of Education, education authorities have to be part of the solution, but it starts with education of society, I think. You educate to build civil society, you educate to build a responsible private sector, you educate to build leaders that will be responsive to the needs of their people. And so we so often get back to education in the region whenever we talk about any issues, and I think this is just one other example. And one way I think the private sector can contribute without saying, well, we need 20 years of a good, strong education system and that will change things, is to participate in government. Private sector skills in government, people joke about a revolving door between government and the private sector. I believe in the revolving door. I think there are skills from government that can be useful in the private sector, and I think private sector skills, particularly in execution, can be very helpful in government. So, don't be afraid of government. Consider it part of your responsibility as a leader.
Saskia, this morning there were a couple of things that were said that I would like to run through you. One is the fact that there is a direct relationship between resilience and governance. You've already mentioned that in your introductory remarks. And the other one is that risk is a social construction. In other words, that it as Ambassador Hrinak has said, and you yourself has said, this needs to be approached integrally. It requires a holistic approach. On the first matter, resilience and governance, you've mentioned the importance of engaging not only the government, the state agencies and the inter-regional agencies, but also the communities and science and the academia. What else can you say about this relationship? Because I find that most of what we need to do goes beyond obviously the immediate. It has to do with a larger issue, even a vision, a national vision or regional vision, the vision thing, as it was called a few decades ago. How do you see that? This social construction as a part of a larger responsibility that we have?
Yeah, you brought up many elements in this question and comment, which are really to the core on how we manage to reduce disaster risk. So that risk of social constructors is actually the other coin that disasters are not natural, because they're actually the most important element that creates a disaster is the vulnerability, and that is it is mostly socially constructed. So I think that's a very important element. And then that's the link to, as I said in my opening remarks, with the Sustainable Development Agenda. We need to embed risk in the DNA of all the development actions. But the problem is that most time decisions are taken for short term. Somebody says no, but it will not happen in my period, in my mandate. So this is going to be more expensive. And it's full of studies that show that if you actually spend a little bit more in your investment, this will then save you up to 15 times once you have to respond. It will protect your investment, be it from the private sector or being it from the government and the public sector. So we need to embed it and invest more in disaster risk reduction when we are creating a new development projects. And then we need to reduce risk that has already been created. And Central America has a lot of risk. Actually, risk is created at a faster pace than the development efforts. So with all these, its complexity dimension that it has. So the rate is always like it has to go faster and faster because risk is increasing, and all our efforts to reduce it are going like slower than how this risk improves, with all the variable that has been discussed today: climate change, social problems, governance weakness, acceptance of policy, how much do we then invest in policies and in plans that have been made. So that's how we need to try and move forward, embedded risk in all decisions that have been made and reduce the existing risk. And as you also brought up, the relation with the science and technology and the academia. This is something that we need to, and actually we are trying actually to work it. We have a regional group that is called STAG, the Science and Technology Regional Group, because a lot of information, a lot of evidence is produced by the academia and by the scientific entities, but most time this evidence is not taken into account when policy is drafted and when public investment is made. So we need to kind of make this bridge stronger, that all this evidence that's being produced. There's a lot of scenarios. I was reading a paper the other day on scenarios on extreme events, actually, and it was related to today, on new models and new frameworks, but then these are not taken into account when governments decide public policy. So that has to be strengthened, and relation can be very beneficial between both of them, because what the academia produces and the scientific community then can be actually tested and piloted through real development, disaster risk reduction entities. And the private sector, I'm really happy the private sector is part of this conversation, and it's been recognized such as important in this panel and the conclusion remarks of this event, because we are always pushing. One of the message is that on average, more than 70% of investment in a country is from the private sector. It's an approximate, it's an average data, but this means that if resilience and disaster risk reduction is not embedded also in that investment, then we are also supporting this creation of risk through time. So that's a message, and the US actually works a lot on that. There's this other network which is called the RISE, which is the private sector network for resilient societies. It has a national network in the US that is pushing a lot on the insurance sector, on the infrastructure, on the housing, and really create a resilient investment.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Let's move on to the future. You've been around as a business leader and also as a public servant for a long time. You can have that possibility to look forward. This morning, there were a number of things that were mentioned regarding technology, information technology, communications, again, science and technology. Your previous experience, including working in a highly technological industry as Boeing and the aviation sector. What's the role that technology? You mentioned education, but interestingly enough, you're one of the first ones who mentioned education throughout the day. It was not mentioned before. And that brings out, of course, being a teacher, I'm very appreciative of this, the role that we have in preparing the human talent necessary to deal with this highly specialized, sometimes highly specialized technologies to deal with this phenomenon. But thinking ahead, what do you make of the use of these new tools that we have in dealing with these issues?
Yes, so as Saskia says, there is already a lot of data available. The science has been working on this. The gap is getting the science into the decision-making process. And that's where I'm afraid too often the communication breaks down, either because the scientists aren't able to present it in a way that's appealing or understandable to lay people, and I have some appreciation for that, or because it doesn't match what the public policy agenda is at that time. And Saskia talked about politicians who say, well, if this doesn't happen in my mandate, I don't want to do it. And there's nothing like inaugurating a bridge to make a politician happy, right? And we've all seen that. But the private sector is also afflicted with that because, we have quarterly reports, right? We have to go to Wall Street and explain how we made our money and how we spent our money. And so we also have too much of a short-term agenda. Science can give us a longer-term view. And I think that's how maybe we could get some of the thinking to change when dealing with these issues. You see how long it takes to recover from a disaster. You see how many years that disaster, not natural, that disaster was in the making and all the factors that contributed to it. The data is there. And it's a matter of education for the policymakers, for the politicians, for the private sector. And at the end of the day, it's a cost-benefit analysis and a return on your investment, right? If you make the investment today, here the data shows that this is what the payback will be next year, or 5 years down the road, or 10 years down the road. And putting it in stark terms, you'll have a better message for your stockholders than if you had not made this investment today.
Absolutely. Saskia, one of the things that has been repeated throughout this conference has been the necessary approach from the capacity building side, and obviously that has to do a lot with technology as well. I mean, this cannot be solved in one action, in one act. You cannot buy the radars and have the technicians and do the roads, and you have to build up, and this is a gradual exercise. How do you frame the issue of capacity building? You have to work with this every time from your office, and then you see people that you form, they go away to other activities, they don't stay in government either because they find better opportunities abroad or because of political changes. It's a crucial matter, and capacity building ultimately may mean the successful or unsuccessful administration of a crisis of this, like the ones we've seen. What's the weight you attribute to capacity building within this area?
Yes, capacity building, it's very important because, well, it goes together with the transfer of more technological resources, or also the drafting of policies and plans. Well, we try to do capacity building at different levels of government. So from the local level, at municipal level, actually yesterday morning, the Making City Resilient Initiative 2030 was launched, and that is an initiative to give technical assistance and capacity building to the municipality and governments from big city to smaller cities. Work then with the national level and the regional level. The regional level, as I want to stress it again, it has then a role in following up with government. And then, yeah, there's a challenge that people go away, they move. That happens in all the organizations. So the importance of having a good tools available to go together with this capacity building, things that you can replicate, things that you can scale up, that have been working. I think that is important. We also try to do a lot of access between English and Spanish, because it's a Spanish-speaking region with a lot of tools and a lot of good practices for capacity building that are available in English. So we try to bridge that by making things accessible in Spanish and making also some adaptation to make it more relevant and more contextual. So, and there is something that's working. And now that the COVID, we are all online, maybe we would have had this forum in person, but now it is all shifted. I think most of us are in our houses, having a conversation all day long, and that opens all the way to e-learning, to e-capacity building, to things that are not in the moment live, but then can stay available in all dimensions through this digital and new way of communicating. It also brings new ways of capacity building. So we're trying to adapt and have more and more tools that can support that. And also the capacity building important in this region is also the South-South cooperation, the cooperation between countries, what has worked and what some region can work in another one. Central America, also there's a lot of, Costa Rica is a country that gives a lot of capacity building and also shows good practices to other countries, because they're things that they've been managed to improve and work in a way. So we also try to create this knowledge sharing and the sharing of good practice among countries themselves.
Ambassador, I've been tracking the use of certain words throughout the day, and there are a number of them that have been very that have been highlighted. Innovation, cooperation, integration. They have been commonly used throughout the day, but there are two that have also been used that sometimes create some itching in the private sector. One's regulation, and the other one is planification or planning. Yet I know that you do a lot of both, that you need regulations because this is the way you ensure that your investments can be secured, and that you do a lot of planning. Without planning, it is very difficult to move forward. Now, these events are complicated because, I remember I had to deal with the first hurricane that hit Costa Rica directly back in my administration. And, we had foreseen many things, but that was one we did not see coming, although it was there as a theoretical issue, okay? Same thing can be said about the pandemic. I mean, the size of this thing, we knew it was coming, we knew it was possible, but the impact and the consequences of it were very difficult to plan. I remember in my case, there was a school that we had taken away from near a river in an indigenous region of Costa Rica. We took it out of where it was. We built it in a completely different place where we thought the river would never come. And during the tropical storm, it was, destroyed by the river. And it's just too big. It was a monstrous flooding. So how to deal with this, with the planning, with regulations, so that they become useful for human betterment?
Let me talk about regulation first. And there is a natural tendency among the private sector to want a hands-off approach from government, but you're right, that doesn't work. We benefit well from regulation, especially if you think you're a good actor, because not everyone in your sector is necessarily going to be a good actor, and you want to make sure that they're living up to the same standards you are. So yeah, regulation is important. It keeps us all honest. And it makes us all understand, I think, how we are part of society and how our actions can have unintended consequences. And we need to be on the lookout for that. The best regulations are ones that are developed in consultation with the people who are going to be regulated, to make sure they are realistic, to make sure that that the bodies that are going to be regulated don't spend all of their time fighting against those regulations and trying to get them overturned instead of trying to implement them in the most positive way possible. The dialogue between the regulators and the private sector is really important. And that's, it's sort of the way we hold our trustees meetings at FIU too, right? They're sunshine meetings. They're open. The public can come in and make comments. And that's the kind of consultation process I'm talking about, not some back room, conversations, but open dialogue about how these regulations can best work to achieve the goals of society and to let the private sector operate in a way that makes them a successful business also. You can't plan for everything, right? I mean, no matter how much you plan. I'll give you another example. I'm on a board of a for-profit higher education organization. We had a medical school in Dominica that got wiped out by one of the hurricanes recently. So that campus was moved to Barbados. We built new facilities, including housing for students and faculty. And then a year later, all those students and faculty had to be evacuated to the US because, of course, COVID struck and people couldn't travel. So, how do you, plan that your investment will then be, in effect, the usefulness will be put on hold for a year. But what I think you can plan is plan for agility. Know that you're going to have to respond to unexpected developments and make sure that you're not so set in the way you do things and the plans that you have that you can't adapt when the circumstances demand it. And circumstances demand it all the time anymore. And when you look around the way the world operates now, the technology is different. But the threats are different, the risks are different too. You have to be agile. And then I think you have to just, devote some energy to looking at your planning process and saying, how does this work for me? How does this work for my partners? How does this work for my customers or my suppliers? Don't just plan because you have to do a long range business plan, 5 years, throw the numbers up on the screen and everybody's happy, but really think about how that plan is going to impact the broad range of stakeholders.
Thank you very much. I think we have just a few more minutes for closing remarks, and both of you. So Saskia, I saw that you were nodding as Ambassador Hrinak was talking about this planning and regulations. But please go ahead and give us your perspective and some, unfortunately, closing remarks, because we're approaching now the time to end our conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, the conversation is really interesting. Yeah, the planning and regulation is very important, even if it's even more challenging, because we, as I said at the beginning, we have all these complex events, more and more compound. The Sendai framework kept talking about biological hazard because there was a pressure to put that in the negotiation due to what we had learned from Ebola and SARS, but nobody was really putting emphasis to biological hazard. And last year, well, even 2 years, in 19, COVID came. So the example, as the ambassador said, everything moved to Barbados, and nobody was foreseeing this type of crisis. So we need to, yes, to plan as much as possible for complex scenario, and that's where the academia can have a role in supporting these understanding of what scenarios can actually come forward. But then we also need to be flexible, agile, and resilience. Resilience, actually, if we look at the definition of resilience, it's the capacity to go back to the previous state or even better after the impact of an event. So that's actually the word comes from engineering, from psychology, some decades ago, because we are resilient personally when we have to face a tragic loss, for example, emotionally and psychology. A building is resilient when its capacity is to absorb shocks, so for example, earthquake movement. So the real resilience, it means that the capacity to respond in an agile way to protect life, to protect assets. Then, as my concluding remarks, we have been talking a lot about governance, but we've also been talking a lot about systemic risk. This came out in 2019, a global assessment report, which is kind of our flagship report globally on the status of disaster risk worldwide. We are going to publish in the following months the regional assessment report, which gives an overview on the Latin America and the Caribbean. And something that we're bringing more and more forward is this concept of systemic risk, where risks are interconnected, but not in a linear way, much and more complex, as we can see also with COVID. COVID started as a health crisis, but it had a huge impact, for example, on education. And what is the relation between health and education? So risk, we need to see it in a more and more integral way, in a systemic way, to try to understand all its different dimensions, and then be able to actually have a development that is risk sensitive. So I invite you all to look forward to the regional assessment report when it comes out.
We shall look for it, undoubtedly. Ambassador Hrinak, your turn. The floor is yours.
Well, this conversation has reinforced a couple of the ideas I came in with: the need for collaboration, the need for sharing best practices, and the role that the private sector really can play in addressing these the vulnerabilities that exist, and ensuring that we don't just respond, because I think we respond really well, but we help in that long-term recovery. I looked up the definition of resilience too, and it said something about that you recover in a way that does not compromise your long-term development. And I think that that's the approach we have to take. How are we, if we want to continue to do business in these locations, how are we ensuring that their development is progressing? How are we ensuring that they're getting to be better places for people to live, and where people will, you mentioned migration, where people will want to live, so that we can all benefit from their hard work and our hard work in a collaboration.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Hrinak, dear Saskia Carusi. Saskia is the External Relations Officer for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Regional Office for the Americas and the Caribbean in Panama. And Ambassador Donna Hrinak is the Senior Vice President of the Royal Caribbean Group and a member of the Florida International University's Board of Trustees, former Ambassador of the United States and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State Department. Thank you both, and thank you all for joining us in this exciting day, which has been a very interesting event. I thank everybody who has made it possible. And without further ado, Jose Miguel, I send the word back to you. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you, President Solís. Thank you, Saskia Carusi. Thank you, Ambassador Donna Hrinak. This has been a wonderful conference, and I believe a productive day, a great panel. Central America needs all the help it can get, and our purpose at LAC and at FIU has been to foster the evidence-based discussion on vulnerabilities and risk in the region. We expect this has been constructive for public officials, civil society, and anyone concerned about the future of Central America. I just want to, on behalf of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, the Stephen J. Green School for International Public Affairs, the Stream Events Institute, and the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, just want to thank all the participants throughout the day, the panelists, the technical team, and you, the public who remain with us throughout the day. We will be posting the videos of each panel in the next week or so in our website, www.lac.fiu.edu. And with this, again, I thank you all and I wish you remain healthy and safe. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.